Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. His early years gave little hint of the horror that would follow, but there were undercurrents of trouble almost from the beginning. His father, a chemist, and his mother, a homemaker with mental health challenges, frequently argued, creating a tense home environment. Jeffrey was a quiet, introverted child, but he was not entirely isolated. He had friends, participated in school activities, and appeared, at least outwardly, normal. However, by the time he reached adolescence, darker impulses began to take hold. Fascination with the dead emerged early. At age 4, Dahmer witnessed his father removing animal bones from beneath the family home. The sound and texture of the bones made an impression. By his teenage years, he had begun collecting roadkill, dissecting animals, and bleaching skeletons, a ritual that both intrigued and calmed him. These acts were more than morbid curiosity, they were the earliest expressions of a compulsion that would later evolve into something far more sinister. By high school, Dahmer was drinking heavily, even sneaking alcohol into class in a styrofoam cup. Teachers and classmates described him as both a clown and a loner, known for pulling bizarre pranks and mimicking people with seizures, but also showing a disturbing interest in violence. His parents' divorce in 1978, and the emotional neglect he suffered in its aftermath, further deepened his isolation. Dahmer's first murder occurred shortly after his graduation from high school. In June 1978, just 3 weeks after turning 18, he picked up 18-year-old hitchhiker Stephen Hicks. Dahmer invited him home for drinks, and after several hours of conversation, when Hicks wanted to leave, Dahmer panicked. He bludgeoned Hicks with a dumbbell, strangled him, and later dismembered the body in the basement of his parents' home. The remains were crushed with a sledgehammer and scattered in the woods. He would later retrieve the bones, pulverize them, and dispose of the powder in the backyard. After that first killing, Dahmer tried to suppress his urges. He enrolled at Ohio State University but dropped out after one semester due to his drinking. In 1979, he joined the U.S. Army, serving as a combat medic in Germany. Though reports would later suggest he assaulted 2 fellow soldiers during this time, no charges were ever brought. He was discharged in 1981 for alcohol abuse. Back in the United States, Dahmer drifted between jobs and addresses. He spent time in Florida before returning to his grandmother's home in West Allis, Wisconsin. There, he would spend most of the 1980s concealing his darkening desires behind a mask of normalcy. He worked in a chocolate factory, attended church with his grandmother, and maintained a facade of routine. But internally, the compulsion to kill was rising again. In 1987, Dahmer committed his second murder, 9 years after the first. On November 20, he met 25-year-old Stephen Twomey at a Milwaukee hotel. They drank together and, according to Dahmer, he had no memory of the actual killing. He awoke to find Twomey dead, with bruises and blood indicating a violent struggle. In a panic, Dahmer bought a large suitcase, transported the body to his grandmother's house, and dismembered it in the basement. He disposed of the remains gradually in the trash, keeping Twomey's severed head in a cardboard box for weeks before boiling it and crushing the skull. This marked the beginning of a gruesome pattern. Between 1987 and 1991, Dahmer would go on to murder 15 more victims, all male, most of them young and many of them from marginalized communities. His preferred method was chillingly methodical. He would lure men to his apartment, usually under the pretense of paying for photographs or sex, drug them with sleeping pills, and then strangle them once unconscious. As his crimes escalated, so did their depravity. In addition to murder, Dahmer engaged in necrophilia and cannibalism. He would have sex with the corpses, pose the bodies for Polaroids, and preserve select body parts as souvenirs. Skulls, genitalia, and internal organs were kept in drawers, refrigerators, and even in a filing cabinet. With each victim, he seemed to be experimenting, not just with ways to kill, but with how to control and possess them permanently. One of the most disturbing aspects of Dahmer's crimes was his attempt to create living sex slaves. He drilled holes into his victims' skulls and injected hydrochloric acid or boiling water directly into the brain, hoping to induce a zombie-like state. These grotesque experiments inevitably resulted in death, often after prolonged suffering. Victims such as Konorak Synthesomphon, a 14-year-old boy, died under horrific circumstances after briefly escaping, only to be returned to Dahmer's apartment by police who were grossly negligent in their investigation. Dahmer's cruelty was systematic, his methods increasingly organized. He purchased freezers and vats of acid for corpse disposal and kept detailed records of his murders. He even constructed a shrine of skulls and bones, a private altar that he envisioned completing as a place of power and reflection. His home was a chamber of death, lined with trophies of his crimes and marked by the scent of rot and decay. Throughout this killing spree, Dahmer remained largely invisible to law enforcement. Despite frequent complaints from neighbors about foul odors and suspicious behavior, no serious action was taken. Dahmer's polite demeanor and quiet lifestyle allowed him to evade scrutiny for years. His white privilege and calculated deception masked the full extent of his savagery, even when the signs were right in front of authorities. By 1991, his impulses were no longer manageable. He was killing more frequently, taking greater risks, and descending further into madness. His final victim, Joseph Braidhoft, was murdered in July 1991. By then, Dahmer had grown careless, and the walls of secrecy were beginning to crack. By early 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's descent into madness had become unstoppable. Operating from his apartment on North 25th Street in Milwaukee, he was spiraling into a dark abyss, unchecked and undetected. In just 6 months, he would claim the lives of 8 more men, pushing the total body count to 17. These were not impulsive acts, they were methodically planned, chilling in their precision, and each one pushed Dahmer further into depravity. On April 7, 1991, Dahmer lured 19-year-old Errol Lindsay into his apartment. Lindsay was the first victim subjected to Dahmer's twisted attempt at creating a sex zombie. After drugging him, Dahmer drilled a hole into his skull and poured hydrochloric acid into the wound, hoping to leave Lindsay alive but permanently subdued. The experiment failed. Lindsay regained consciousness briefly before succumbing to his injuries. Dahmer later admitted that Lindsay's death was different. He wanted to keep him alive longer, but his technique had not yet perfected the horror he envisioned. That same month, a new pattern emerged. Dahmer began keeping more body parts, hearts, biceps, entire torsos. His freezer became a grotesque collection of preserved flesh. He purchased a 57-gallon drum to dissolve bodies in acid, aiming to eliminate all evidence while still keeping trophies. In May, he murdered Tony Hughes, a 31-year-old deaf man. Dahmer used written notes to communicate with Hughes, giving the impression of trust. After luring him back to the apartment, he drugged and killed him, keeping his body for 3 days before dismembering it. Just days later, on May 27, Dahmer encountered 14-year-old Conorak Synthosomphan. This wasn't the first time he'd targeted the Synthosomphan family. 3 years earlier, he had been convicted of sexually assaulting Conorak's older brother. The repeat offense would become one of the most infamous failures in law enforcement history. Dahmer drugged Conorak and, again, attempted to create a submissive living partner by drilling into his skull and injecting acid. Leaving the boy alone while he went to purchase beer, Dahmer returned to find Conorak had escaped. Naked, bleeding, and incoherent, the boy was discovered by 2 women who called police. Officers Joseph Gabrish and John Balcerzak arrived on the scene. Instead of investigating thoroughly, they accepted Dahmer's claim that Conorak was his intoxicated boyfriend. Ignoring the protests of concerned neighbors and the clear signs of trauma, the officers escorted the boy back into Dahmer's apartment, unknowingly delivering him to his death. Dahmer later murdered Conorak, dismembered him, and retained his skull alongside Hughes's, which was still inside the apartment. The police failure sparked national outrage once the truth came out, especially considering Dahmer was a registered sex offender with a known criminal record involving young boys. By July, Dahmer was spiraling even deeper. He murdered Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft in quick succession. Each killing followed the same grim ritual: drugging, attempted lobotomy, strangulation, and dismemberment. With Weinberger, Dahmer tried injecting boiling water directly into the brain, a variation of his acid method. It caused irreversible brain damage, but Weinberger clung to life for 2 days before dying. Oliver Lacey's murder was particularly disturbing. Dahmer kept Lacey's heart and biceps for consumption and placed his head in the refrigerator. Days later, Braidhoft's remains were found in a state of decomposition inside Dahmer's apartment, his torso submerged in the blue barrel of acid, his head stored with others in the freezer. The stench of death permeated the building, prompting multiple complaints from neighbors. But it wasn't until one victim escaped that the full extent of Dahmer's atrocities would finally be revealed. On July 22, 1991, 32-year-old Tracy Edwards met Dahmer at a mall. Promised money to pose for photos, Edwards followed him back to the apartment. Once inside, he noticed the foul smell, the darkened room, and a sense that something wasn't right. Dahmer placed a handcuff on Edwards's wrist and threatened him with a knife. For several hours, he tried to calm Dahmer while secretly planning his escape. At one point, Edwards struck Dahmer and fled through the apartment door, still wearing the handcuff. He flagged down police officers and led them back to the apartment. Once inside, the officers discovered not just physical evidence of a struggle, but a full-blown house of horrors. Opening the refrigerator, one officer found a freshly severed human head resting inside. A search of the freezer revealed 3 more heads, wrapped in plastic. Further inspection uncovered 7 skulls, 2 preserved hearts, a torso in the acid drum, and multiple photographs of corpses at various stages of mutilation. The walls were lined with Polaroids showing dismembered bodies and severed limbs, positioned in disturbing poses. One drawer held painted skulls. Another contained jars filled with genitalia. There were cooking utensils coated with human residue. It was as if Dahmer had created his own private museum of death. The crime scene was so gruesome that officers were visibly shaken. It took forensic teams weeks to catalogue the evidence, but it was already clear, this was one of the most shocking cases of serial murder in U.S. history. During his initial interrogation, Dahmer was cooperative, almost unnervingly calm. He confessed in detail, recounting every murder, explaining his techniques, and even expressing a twisted sense of relief that it was finally over. What stunned investigators most wasn't just the volume of killings, but the psychological elements underpinning them. Dahmer didn't kill out of anger or hatred. He murdered to fulfill fantasies of control, sexual domination, and possession. He wanted to create submissive partners who could never leave him. His cannibalism wasn't about hunger, it was about keeping his victims close, even after death. Over the next several days, Dahmer led authorities through every detail of his crimes. He identified each victim, explained how he disposed of their remains, and admitted to experimenting on bodies after death. He described how he would photograph each stage of the dismemberment process, both to relive the act and to feel empowered. The photographs, he claimed, were mementos. The bones, the flesh, he saw them as trophies, pieces of individuals he believed now belonged to him. Media coverage exploded. Protesters gathered outside the apartment building, which was soon demolished to erase the physical memory of what occurred inside. Families of victims were devastated not only by the loss of their loved ones, but by the graphic details that poured out during police interviews and press conferences. The public demanded answers. How had Dahmer operated unnoticed for so long? Why had police failed to stop him earlier? These questions would haunt Milwaukee for years, and would later be dissected in the courtroom during his trial. But for now, Dahmer was finally off the streets. The reign of terror that began with a hitchhiker in 1978 had ended, thanks to one man's desperate act of survival. When Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested on July 22, 1991, it wasn't just the end of a killing spree, it was the start of a legal, psychological, and moral reckoning. Within hours of his arrest, Dahmer began cooperating with law enforcement, giving chillingly calm confessions. He walked investigators through each of the 17 murders, detailing how he had lured, drugged, murdered, and dismembered his victims. It was more than admission, it was storytelling without remorse. On July 25, he was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Within weeks, the charges grew to 15, as authorities identified more remains from his apartment. In September, Ohio officials added one more count for the 1978 murder of Stephen Hicks, his first known victim, killed when Dahmer was just 18. Each charge stacked a life sentence upon another, but the full weight of justice was still to come. The trial began on January 30, 1992, in Milwaukee. The courtroom was packed, flanked by grieving families, reporters from around the world, and a public still struggling to grasp the enormity of what he had done. Dahmer had pleaded guilty but insane to the 15 Wisconsin murders. The trial was not about whether he committed the crimes, he had admitted to all of them, but whether he was mentally competent when he did. His defense team argued that Dahmer suffered from severe mental illness, including necrophilia and psychotic impulses, citing his fantasies, delusions, and attempts to create zombie-like companions. They described his actions not as those of a monster, but a man driven by unrelenting mental disease. Psychiatrists for the defense diagnosed him with borderline personality disorder, schizotypal disorder, and necrophilic tendencies bordering on the psychotic. But the prosecution argued the opposite, that Dahmer knew exactly what he was doing, that his killings were premeditated and methodically concealed. He lured victims using deceit, avoided detection through calculated lies, and modified his methods when risks increased. The planning, the photography, the preservation, all pointed to sanity. Jurors listened to days of grim, forensic testimony. They heard about body parts stored in fridges, about boiling heads in cooking pots, about the altar Dahmer had planned to build from his victims' remains. They saw the photographs he took, of corpses in dismembered poses, and the shrine-like setup in his bedroom, designed as a temple to his obsession. On February 15, 1992, the verdict was delivered. The jury found Dahmer legally sane and guilty on all 15 counts. Judge Lawrence Graham sentenced him to 15 consecutive life terms, totaling 957 years in prison. Later, he received a 16th life sentence for Stephen Hicks' murder in Ohio. The sentence was symbolic, there would be no chance of parole, no end other than death behind bars. At Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, Dahmer entered the general prison population, at his own request. He told officials he didn't want special treatment. But his notoriety followed him. Other inmates viewed him with a mixture of disgust, morbid curiosity, and simmering rage. His crimes had targeted mostly young men of color, and many prisoners saw him as the embodiment of racial, sexual, and moral transgression. Surprisingly, Dahmer appeared calm in confinement. He reportedly embraced religion, was baptized by a prison minister, and even began corresponding with evangelical groups. Some saw it as a final attempt at redemption, others called it an act. He maintained a reserved demeanor, never lashing out, never expressing deep regret beyond stating he deserved his punishment. But prison was never going to be a safe haven. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned a janitorial task with two other inmates, Jesse Anderson, serving time for the murder of his wife, and Christopher Scarver, a convicted murderer with a history of schizophrenia. The trio was left unsupervised in a shower block. Moments later, staff found Dahmer lying on the floor, unresponsive, bludgeoned with a metal bar from gym equipment. His skull had been crushed. Scarver had struck Dahmer repeatedly in the head and face. Jesse Anderson suffered the same fate and later died from his injuries. Scarver would later tell investigators that God had instructed him to carry out the attack. He claimed Dahmer had mocked inmates with food shaped like body parts, and that he was unrepentant about his crimes. Dahmer was pronounced dead an hour later at a nearby hospital. He was 34 years old. Public reaction to Dahmer's death was split. Some saw it as justice delivered where the legal system had failed, an eye for an eye in the rawest form. Others lamented the missed opportunity to study him further, to understand what creates a man capable of such horror. His body was cremated, his ashes divided between his parents. His brain, initially preserved for scientific study, was ultimately incinerated at the family's request, ending any plans for posthumous research. The Oxford apartments where the murders occurred were demolished in 1992, leaving behind only an empty lot, an eerie absence where unimaginable terror once lived. In the aftermath, families of the victims continued to grapple with grief. Lawsuits were filed, debates ignited over policing failures, and discussions about racism, homophobia, and mental health entered the national conversation. The Milwaukee Police Department faced intense scrutiny, especially for returning Konorak Synthesomphon to Dahmer after he had clearly escaped. Officers involved in that decision were fired, then controversially reinstated. Media portrayals of Dahmer multiplied, books, films, documentaries, and interviews dissected every facet of his life and crimes. His name became synonymous with deviance. Yet despite all the coverage, the core horror remained unchanged: 17 lives brutally stolen, families shattered, and one of the darkest chapters in American criminal history carved in blood and bone. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't just kill. He annihilated, consumed, and desecrated. His crimes blurred the boundary between man and monster. And although justice was served, the trauma lingers. For every victim, there was a mother, a sibling, a friend, people who would forever live in the shadow of his violence. Today, his story serves not as a fascination, but as a grim reminder: predators can wear polite faces, horrors can hide in plain sight, and sometimes, the monster lives next door. Thank you for listening to Crime Echoes with Lewis. Please like this video and subscribe to my channel for more content like this.